But it seemed to me that the area that nobody was focusing on was developing people's thinking skills, which is actually easier to do than help them in terms of their emotional intelligence.
Why would you say that it's easier?
Well, for the reason that the parts of the brain that run people's emotional makeup are laid down at a deeper level and at an earlier age, and therefore they're kind of cemented in, and they're less pliable than the parts of the brain that manage their thinking processes.
Do you think also it's because you would describe yourself as being very logically led, so there was sort of a bias on your part in terms of your own understanding of how your own brain works?
I would say that possibly thinking about myself 20 years ago, but I wouldn't necessarily say that about myself now. So there's been a shift there.
Oh, well done.
And in fact, the more that I've worked in this area, and the more I've used the kind of principles of meta-thinking in my own approach to my work, the more I realize that you can't really separate out the emotional side and the thinking side, that these two are inextricably intertwined. And although we make a separation of the two in language and try and point to different parts of the brain, it's not nearly that simple.
Agreed. Does meta-thinking incorporate the emotional intelligence of the mind?
Well, there I think, to answer the question, I'd really have to give some kind of definition of emotional intelligence.
But also it'd be interesting to receive a definition of what meta-thinking is, because you've used the word once or twice, and I think it would be helpful for viewers to have a clear understanding of exactly what is meta-thinking and how does it help transform one's thinking and emotional welfare.
Well, the prefix meta is an interesting word. It actually sort of seems to be quite popular these days. But for me, meta has a connotation of something above and beyond, possibly transcending even. It also has a connotation of pointing to something in itself. And psychologists use a term called metacognition. And that sounds rather scientific and somewhat abstruse. And I was hoping with the idea of meta-thinking to come up with a term that was slightly more popular, but basically captured the idea of thinking about thinking. And it's simple as that, really. Metacognition, as used by psychologists, refers to some very broad ideas about the way people think and how they manage themselves while they're thinking. Meta-thinking, I'd say, is a little bit narrower than that. And it has to do with focusing on the structures of people's thought. One structure being a kind of logical structure. If this, then that would be a very simple logical structure. And meta-thinking says, well, let's look at the different structures that we use when we think. And if we become aware that we're using specific structures, then perhaps we might have a choice about which structure we use.
So it's empowering in many ways.
Say again, sorry?
It's empowering.
Well, it's potentially empowering. And I don't pretend any of this is easy, Lorna, at all. But I think that it's easy just to go through life thinking things in a particular way because one's been educated that way. and we have these patterns, and they seem to be pretty reliable, and not go beyond that. But the world is complex, and there's no question in my mind that we're very limited in how we perceive the world in terms of capturing the full reality of what's out there. We only get a tiny bit of what is really going on. And therefore, it kind of behoves us to try and think about what's going on in different ways. And if we can think about things in different ways, then I somehow hold out some hope for humankind, if I can put it that way.